Nowhere to Call Home by Cynthia DeFelice, Chapter 24. Frankie didn't know how long she and Stewpot had been lying on the ground when she heard a voice. "What's the problem, boys?" Frankie felt a hand on the back of her head. For a moment, the voice seemed familiar, and her heart lifted. She raised her head, but no, it wasn't Junius. Of course it wasn't Junius. The man staring down at her looked nothing at all like Junius. Even so, Frankie felt relief flood through her at the sight of him. He reached for her hand and swept her to her feet, then leaned down and scooped Stewpot up as if he were a baby. "Come on," he said. Dazed, Frankie followed the man through the maze of shacks and smoking fires. He stopped at a structure made, it appeared to Frankie, from the roof of a car set over walls made of boards. Across the doorway hung a rug. The man swept it aside and said with a twisted smile, "Welcome to my humble home." Frankie stepped past him into the dim room. The man followed her inside, set Stewpot down on a makeshift cot, and lit a small oil lamp. Both Frankie and the man looked at Stewpot, who was panting shallowly, his eyes closed. "He's pretty sick," the man observed. Frankie nodded, unable to speak. "You both could use some hot tea," the man said briskly, rummaging in a corner and coming up with a pot. "Be right back. Oh, the name's Jack, but everybody around here calls me Sawbones, on account of I was once studying to be a doc. I'm Frankie Blue, and this is—" Frankie swallowed the sudden lump in her throat. "Stewpot." She rushed on desperately. "Is he going to be all right?" "Hang on there, Frank. Let me get this pot going, then we'll see what's what." Frankie waited. After a while, she heard Jack return, and she peeked out the doorway to watch as he stirred the fire to life and hung the pot over it to boil. She joined him by the fire. "Jack," she said hesitantly, "you said you were studying to be a doctor. Can you help Stewpot?" Jack sighed deeply and shook his head. "I didn't get very far in medical school, Frank. All that responsibility, life and death in my hands. It's scary, you know what I mean?" Frankie did know. At least she knew what it felt like to have Stewpot nearly dying just 3 feet away. She pleaded, "You must have learned something." "Look," said Jack, "I'm telling you, I'm no doctor." His voice was loud, almost angry. He seemed to make an effort to calm himself, then said quietly, "But it looks like pneumonia." He asked about Stewpot's symptoms and nodded as Frankie recounted them. "Yeah, sounds like pneumonia, all right." Frankie had heard of pneumonia, but had never known anyone who'd had it. "He'll get over it, though, won't he?" Jack looked uncomfortable. "About half the people who get it do," he said. Then he added, "But your friend's pretty bad off. I can't imagine those nights in the boxcar helped him any." "Can't we do something?" Jack shrugged. "All you can do is try and keep him warm. Make him drink something, even if he doesn't want to, and wait." "Wait?" With a gasp of despair, Frankie turned back into the little room and knelt beside Stewpot. Gazing at his pale, still face, she cried, "Stew, can you hear me? You can't die." Her voice rose, and she couldn't stop it. "Stew? Stew, can you hear me? Answer me, please." Stewpot opened his eyes and looked toward Frankie without seeing her. His eyes had a strange, faraway look as he said, almost dreamily, "Them mountains sure are pretty, ain't they?" Frankie was frightened. "Stewpot," she begged. "I'm going for help. Don't die. Do you hear me, Stew? Wait for me." A faint smile crossed Stewpot's face. "Look at them mountains," he murmured before closing his eyes. Frankie watched him with horror. His face looked blue. His lips were blue. She leaned down and placed her ear against his chest and listened to his labored breath rattle through his lungs. Grasping his shoulders, she began whispering urgently, "You're going to get well, Stew. I know it. And then," she thought to herself, "then I'm going to Chicago and taking you with me, no matter what you say." What if she were no longer welcome? Not to mention Stewpot. She pushed the thought away. "I'll beg her on my hands and knees if I have to," she whispered. First, she had to get Stewpot well enough to travel. Jumping up, she pushed past the rug hanging in the doorway and said to Jack, "Watch him for me." Hearing the commanding tone in her voice, she added, "Please, I'll be back as soon as I can." "Sure you're coming back?" Jack looked at her speculatively. "You're not just ditching him here, are you?" "Of course I'm coming back," Frankie said angrily. Then, remembering that Jack had been the only person to offer help, and that she still needed him, she controlled her impatience. "Look, Jack," she said, "it was real nice of you to help me. I'm going for a doctor. Would you watch him while I'm gone?" "Weren't you listening? A doctor's only going to tell you the same thing I did." Seeing the stubborn line of Frankie's jaw, Jack's expression changed to a curious mixture of amusement, pity, and admiration. You really think you're gonna get a doctor to come to Bumtown? He asked. Yes, Frankie answered. She would find a doctor and pay him, and he would come. She was sure of it. But she didn't say this to Jack. She knew better than to tell a penniless stranger that she had money. Jack returned to his contemplation of the fire. I'm not going anywhere, was all he said. Frankie left the shantytown and walked to a prosperous section of the city. She didn't know how to go about finding a doctor and was afraid to approach people on the street after her experiences earlier that day. She walked until she saw outside a well-tended house a shingle that read, Charles Taft, M.D., hours by appointment. She climbed the steps and rang the buzzer. After a moment, a woman in a white nurse's uniform came to the door. As soon as she saw Frankie, her expression grew stern and disapproving. Before Frankie had the chance to speak, the woman said, We don't give handouts here. The door was closing in Frankie's face. Quickly she said, Please, ma'am, I don't want a handout. I'm looking for a doctor. The woman peered through the narrow crack of the doorway and said, Dr. Taft is busy. He can't see every Tom, Dick, and Harry who comes in off the street. But I can pay, Frankie cried frantically as the door shut the rest of the way. She turned to leave, then spun around and yelled, And his name is James. She continued to walk the streets, growing more and more discouraged as she was turned away at one door after another. The short December day was growing dark when she happened along a large brick hospital. With a cry of relief, she ran through the front door and up to the reception desk. Frankie explained what she wanted, making sure to say that she had money and would pay. The woman behind the desk replied, Bring your friend in, and a doctor will see him. But I can't, said Frankie. He's too sick. I'm very sorry, the woman said. She did look sorry, but there's nothing I can do unless you bring him here. If he comes here, we'll do everything we can for him. Frankie walked out the front door of the hospital. On the street, she burst into sobs of fury and frustration. She walked through the darkening streets, ignoring the stares of the people she passed. After several blocks, she forced herself to grow calm and think. She had to get Stewpot to the hospital. There must be a way. A taxi! On a busy downtown street, Frankie waved at 5 different cabs, but the drivers appeared not to see her. Finally, she took a couple of bills out of her pocket and waved them at the next taxi. The driver pulled over. When she asked to go to Hooverville, she asked to see her money again. Wearily, she handed him $1. When she pulled up at the outskirts of Hooverville, she said, Keep the change, and if you'll wait here, I'll be right back. I just want to go to the hospital. She hurried to Jack's shelter and found him where she had left him, staring into the dwindling fire. He looked up at Frankie's tear-streaked face and didn't say a word. She went past him and into the room to check on Stewpot. Stew, she said softly. Stewpot lay still, his breathing loud and ragged in the small, close space. Stew, wake up. We're going to the hospital. Stewpot didn't answer or even open his eyes. Frightened, Frankie called. Jack, there's a taxi waiting. I'm taking Stewpot to the hospital. Will you help me carry him? Jack pushed past the rug into the room. Frank, he said hesitantly. Just then, Stewpot made a gurgling sound and began to cough and choke, his body heaving, as if someone were shaking him by the shoulders. His eyes remained shut, the spasm passed, and a reddish-brown froth appeared at his mouth. Sobbing, Frankie wiped the spittle away with her coat sleeve. Help me, she screamed, frantic now. Placing her hands beneath Stewpot's shoulders, she looked up at Jack. Grab his feet. You really got a cab? Asked Jack, eyeing her waringly. Yes, just help me. Together they carried Stewpot's limp body through the darkness, past the flickering shadows made by fires and oil lamps, to the edge of the shantytown. It seemed to take forever, and Stewpot's body was a dull dead weight. Frankie was relieved to see the cab still waiting in the same spot. She leaned close to Stewpot and whispered happily, You'll be at the hospital in no time, Stew. But her eyes turned quickly to dismay when she looked into his eyes. They were dim and unseeing. His expression was oddly blank. Alarmed, she pressed her ear to his chest. Instead of harsh, ragged breathing, there was only silence. Stewpot, no!